The hill country south of Jerusalem, in the late 11th century before Christ, was quieter than the Hebrew Bible sometimes suggests. Bethlehem, perched on a limestone ridge about 8 kilometers south of the Jebusite stronghold that would one day become Jerusalem, was a small agricultural settlement of a few hundred inhabitants, surrounded by terraces of grain, olives and grapevines. In the archaeological strata of Iron Age Luas, roughly 1050 to 1000 before Christ, it would have left almost no record at all, if not for the man whose name became attached to it forever. No monumental buildings, no royal inscriptions, just hills, sheep, and the long shadow of the first king Israel had ever crowned. A man named Saul, whose reign was already unraveling about a day's walk to the north. To understand why a prophet from Ramah would arrive in Bethlehem with a horn of oil hidden in a sacrificial errand, you have to start with how Saul lost the throne before he had finished sitting on it. He had been chosen at the demand of the elders of Israel, who pressed the aging Samuel for a king like the nations around them. For a time, he delivered. He broke the Ammonite siege at Jabesh Gilead and rallied Israel against the Philistines. But 2 episodes broke him. The first was at Gilgal, where, pressed by a Philistine army at Michmash, and watching his men desert, Saul offered the burnt sacrifice himself, instead of waiting the 7 days Samuel had commanded. Samuel arrived, found the smoke still rising, and in 1 Samuel 13 verses 13 and 14 delivered the verdict. You have done a foolish thing. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people. It is the first time the Hebrew Bible uses the phrase that would shadow David for 3,000 years. A man after his own heart. Saul did not yet know it pointed to a child, not yet a soldier, herding sheep south of the future capital. The second episode was the Amalekite War. Saul was commanded to carry out a total ban on the desert raiders who had ambushed Israel at the Exodus. But he executed the campaign and spared the Amalekite king Agag and the best of the livestock. Samuel confronted him at Gilgal a second time. In 1 Samuel 15 verses 22 and 23, the prophet says, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." Saul would rule for years more, but the Spirit would leave him, and somewhere south of where he stood, the man who would replace him was already alive. The 16th chapter of 1 Samuel opens with Samuel grieving, and the Lord telling him to stop. In 1 Samuel 16 verse 1, the Lord says, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." Samuel objects on practical grounds. Saul, paranoid and hardening, would hear of the journey and have him killed. Yahweh gives him a cover. Take a heifer to Bethlehem, announce a sacrifice, invite Jesse and his sons, and the rest would be revealed in the moment. The walk was about 30 kilometers south through Iron Age wooden terrain excavated at sites like Ai, Kirbet Radana, and Bethel, small terraced villages with 4-room houses and collared-rim jars, the material culture of a society barely emerging from chiefdom into kingdom. When Samuel arrived, The elders of Bethlehem trembled. In 1 Samuel 16 verse 4 they ask him, "Do you come in peace?" The trembling was political. A prophet with a horn of oil moving without the king's blessing was, in that century, indistinguishable from a coup. Samuel calmed them, consecrated Jesse and his sons, and the procession of inspection began. Eliab, the eldest, came first, tall, the kind of man whose shoulders fill a doorway. Samuel, who had once anointed Saul because Saul stood a head taller than any other man in Israel, looked at Eliab and assumed he had found the new king. The correction in 1 Samuel 16 verse 7 has become one of the most quoted lines in the Hebrew Bible. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. One by one, 7 sons of Jesse passed before Samuel: Abinadab, Shammah, 4 others the text does not name. Each was rejected. Samuel finally asked Jesse whether these were all the sons he had. Jesse answered that the youngest was in the field with the sheep. The Hebrew word for the youngest, katon, carries the sense of the insignificant one, the one not even worth bringing to a priestly meal. That Jesse had left him in the pasture is itself a comment on how the family ranked him. Samuel ordered him sent for, and the procession halted. No one sat down to eat until the boy arrived. He came in from the hills. The text in 1 Samuel 16 verse 12 describes him in 3 quick phrases. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. The Hebrew word translated glowing with health is admoni, ruddy, the same root that lies behind the name of Edom. He was a teenager, probably between 13 and 17 by the standards of how shepherds were assigned in the ancient Levant. Samuel heard the Lord say in the same verse, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." The prophet poured the oil over the boy's head while his brothers watched. The Spirit of the Lord came on David in power from that day forward, and the text does not say it ever departed. Samuel returned to Ramah. David went back to the sheep. No proclamation, no crown, no army. The most important political event of the 11th century in the Central Highlands had just happened in private, witnessed by a frightened priest, a confused father, and 7 older brothers who were about to spend the next decade watching their youngest do what none of them could have imagined. The consequences began almost at once in Saul's mind. In 1 Samuel 16 verse 14, a single sentence shifts the narrative north. Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. The Hebrew is ruach ra, a harmful spirit, a darkening of mood the text attributes to Yahweh's judgment. Saul's servants suggested music as therapy. One of them remembered a boy, a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite. The recommendation in 1 Samuel 16 verse 18 lists 5 things about him in one breath. He plays well. He is a brave warrior. He speaks well. He is fine-looking. And the Lord is with him. It is the entire David in 5 clauses before the boy has done anything in public. Saul sent for him. Jesse loaded a donkey with bread, wine, and a young goat, and dispatched his youngest as armor-bearer to the king who had just been rejected on his behalf. The boy arrived at Saul's stronghold at Gibeah, almost certainly the site excavated as Tel El-Ful on the Aek-Shihu, northern outskirts of modern Jerusalem, where archaeologists have uncovered a small fortified citadel datable to Iron Age way, and stood in the presence of the king he was destined to replace. Saul, the text says, loved him greatly. The boy played the harp when the dark spirit came, and the king for a time was calmed. The historical question of David's existence is no longer open. A basalt fragment discovered in 1993 at Tel Dan, in the Upper Galilee, bears an Aramaic inscription in which a king of Aram Damascus, almost certainly Hazael, boasts in the late 9th century before Christ of killing kings of the house of David and the house of Israel. It places David about 150 years after his death as the founder of a dynasty recognized by his enemies. Israel Finkelstein has argued that the biblical David is a vastly inflated literary construction, while Amihai Mazar and others have countered that the textual core, the Iron IEA fortifications at sites like Khirbet Qeiyafa and the dynastic memory at Tel Dan point to a real chieftain whose 10th century kingdom was modest in extent, but historical in foundation. By the standards of Iron Age archaeology, the shepherd in the field is the best attested early Israelite king we possess. And in the year Samuel poured the oil, none of that mattered yet. The boy returned to the sheep when the king did not need him, walked back into the hills outside Bethlehem, and waited. The Spirit had come on him. The horn had been emptied. The kingdom had begun to change hands, and not a single person in Israel north of the Bethlehem Ridge knew it. Some years passed. The boy who had played the harp at Gibeah returned to Bethlehem when the dark spirit lifted from Saul, and the king's life resumed its narrow rhythm of border skirmishes against the Philistine cities of the coast. Those cities were 5: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. The Philistine Pentapolis, organized as a confederation of Suranim, lords, who ruled the coastal plains the Israelites had never penetrated. The Philistines were not Semites. They were descendants of one of the great migrations of the late Bronze Age collapse. The Sea Peoples whose movements are recorded in the temple reliefs of Medinet Habu, where the pharaoh Rameses III, around 1175 before Christ, depicts himself driving back ships and chariots filled with men in feathered helmets. The same iconography that survives on the painted pottery of Ashkelon and Ekron. By the time Saul reigned, 3 or 4 generations after that arrival, the Philistine cities were the most heavily armed political centers in the southern Levant. They controlled iron, the working of which the Hebrew Bible explicitly attributes to them in 1 Samuel 13, where the text says no blacksmith could be found in the whole of Israel. The geography that mattered for the encounter that would define David was a narrow valley about 35 kilometers southwest of Jerusalem, called the Valley of Elah. It runs east to west between the Judean foothills and the coastal plain, a natural corridor of incursion. The Philistines, pushing inland, took up position on one ridge near a place called Soko. Saul and Israel encamped on the opposite ridge. Between them lay the Wadi, the dry stream bed where, in the eastern foothills, recent excavations at Khirbet Qeiyafa have uncovered a fortified Israelite town datable to the Iron Ueyeh, with 2 gates and a casement wall, that the archaeologist Yosef Garfinkel has argued reflects exactly the kind of organized polity the Hebrew Bible attributes to the early monarchy. The valley's silence each morning, before the day's exchange of insults, was the silence of 2 armies who had not yet decided to fight. Into that silence morning and evening for 40 days walked a champion. The 17th chapter of 1 Samuel describes him in detail. His height the text gives as 6 cubits and a span, about 290 centimeters in the Masoretic text, or in the older Septuagint and a Qumran fragment, 4 cubits and a span, roughly 210 centimeters. The shorter figure, scholars like Geoffrey Tigay note, is more consistent with the skeletal remains of unusually tall ancient Levantines. In 1 Samuel 17, verses 5 to 7, the text catalogues his armament. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze, weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. The combination is unusual. The bronze helmet, scale corselet, and greaves are characteristic of Aegean and Anatolian warrior tradition. The panoply of Mycenae and Cyprus, surviving into the early Iron Age along the western Anatolian fringe. The iron spear point reflects the Philistine monopoly on the new metallurgy. The portrait is of a champion equipped in the Western Mediterranean style, fighting in the Eastern Mediterranean style of single combat. The man's name was Goliath, and he was from Gath, the easternmost city of the Pentapolis, identified today with the great mound of Tel Safi. His challenge followed a Mediterranean tradition. The Greek epic tradition would later preserve in the duels of the Iliad. Choose a man, send him out. Let him and Goliath decide the war between them. In 1 Samuel 17, verses 8 and 9, he calls across the valley, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." For 40 days, no man in Israel answered, including Saul, who stood a head taller than any other Israelite. The army's silence each morning was a slow erosion of the king's authority. David came down to the camp on an errand for his father. 3 of his older brothers were with the army, and Jesse, anxious for news, sent his youngest with bread, parched grain, and 10 cheeses for the commander of the brothers' regiment. He arrived as the morning challenge was being shouted across the wadi. He heard it and asked the question whose form was already accusatory. In 1 Samuel 17 verse 26 he says, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" His eldest brother, Eliab, hearing him, accused him of pride and curiosity. Word reached Saul that someone wanted to fight, and the boy was brought before the king. What David said to Saul in 1 Samuel 17 verses 34 to 37 is the closest thing the text offers to a self-portrait of the years he had spent in the hills. "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul agreed and tried to dress him in the royal armor. The text in 1 Samuel 17 verse 39 records, almost dryly, that David tried to walk in it and could not, and took it off. He went down to the wadi instead with his shepherd's staff, his sling, and 5 smooth stones from the stream bed. The sling in question was not the slingshot of children's drawings. It was a leather pouch with 2 long cords swung overhead that propelled a stone projectile at velocities modern reconstructions estimate at over 100 kilometers an hour. Trained slingers in the ancient Near East, the Benjamites of Israel, the slingers of Persia and later of Rhodes, were considered a specialist branch of light infantry alongside archers, and their range and accuracy at 50 meters were lethal. 5 smooth stones from a wadi bottom, water-rounded over centuries, were ideal projectiles. David picked them by trade, not symbolically. What followed, the text recounts in 7 verses. Goliath came out, his shield-bearer ahead of him, and saw the boy. He despised him for being a youth. He cursed him by his gods. David answered him in 1 Samuel 17 verse 45, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." He ran toward the line, reached into his bag, slung 1 stone, and struck Goliath in the forehead. The Philistine fell face down. David ran to him, drew the man's own sword from its sheath, and finished him with it. The Philistine line, watching their champion die, broke and ran toward Gath and Ekron, with Israel pursuing them down the valley as far as the gates of both cities. David carried Goliath's head to Jerusalem, the text says. A curious detail, since the city was still Jebusite and would remain so until David captured it years later. The note may reflect the editorial perspective of a scribe writing after the conquest of Jerusalem, projecting onto the moment its later identity as the city of David. The aftermath is what mattered politically. Saul, the next chapter says, would not let David go home anymore. He kept him at court, made him a commander, and sent him out on every campaign. And in 1 Samuel 18, verses 6 and 7, the women of every town in Israel came out to meet the returning army, dancing and singing a refrain that would change the rest of David's life. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. The boy from the field had crossed in a single afternoon from the obscurity of a sacrificial errand to the most dangerous place in Saul's kingdom, the place just inside the king's reach. The transition was instant. The boy who had come back from the wadi with Goliath's head was no longer the boy who had carried cheeses for his brother's commander. He was a captain in Saul's army, married within months to the king's daughter Michal, and bound by sworn covenant to the king's son Jonathan. The court at Gibeah of Saul, the same fortified citadel north of Jerusalem the archaeologist W.F. Albright excavated as Tel el-Ful in the 1920s, was the world he now woke up in. The transition that had taken Joseph years in Egypt took David weeks in Israel, and almost from the first morning, Saul began to suspect that he had let into his household the man Samuel had warned him about. The catalyst was the song. The women of every town had met the returning army with the refrain that gave Saul his thousands and David his tens of thousands. And the arithmetic in the verse, a clear ratio of comparison, was not lost on the king. From that day on, the text in 1 Samuel 18 verse 9 says simply, Saul kept a close eye on David. The Hebrew verb is awan, to eye with suspicion. The dark spirit that David's harp had once calmed returned the next day. And Saul, raving, threw a spear at him as he played. The text says David eluded it. The text says it happened twice. The court began to learn that the young commander's life had become contingent on his own reflexes during music. Saul's strategy shifted from impulse to design. He had a daughter, Merab, and offered her to David in marriage on a single condition. Be valiant for me. Fight the Lord's battles. The condition was a trap. Saul's reasoning, reported by the narrator in 1 Samuel 18 verse 17, is one of the most cynical sentences in the whole biblical history. I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that. Merab was given to another man in the end. But Saul's younger daughter, Michal, loved David, and the king saw a second opportunity. He demanded as the bride price, not silver, which a shepherd's son could never afford, but 100 Philistine foreskins. The price was meant to send David into a frontier raid he was not expected to survive. In 1 Samuel 18, verse 27, the text records the result without comment. David came back with 200. He counted them out before the king. Saul gave him Michal as his wife, and the text adds that the king became more afraid of David than ever, and was his enemy the rest of his days. The other relationship inside the palace was of a different order entirely. Jonathan, the crown prince, had stood with David from the day after Goliath. The 18th chapter opens with a sentence the rabbis would mark as one of the central friendships of the Hebrew Bible. In 1 Samuel 18 verses 1 and 3, the text says, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. The covenant was sealed by the transfer of objects whose meaning in ancient Near Eastern court protocol is unmistakable. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, and his tunic, and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. In the political grammar of the time, the same grammar the Hittite vassal treaties of the late Bronze Age preserve, where a sovereign passes regalia to the man whose succession he recognizes. Jonathan was transferring the symbols of his own future kingship to the son of Jesse. The crown prince was acknowledging, before any of his father's soldiers, that the throne was no longer his to inherit. Saul moved openly to murder. He told Jonathan and his attendants to kill David. Jonathan warned David, hid him in a field, and pleaded his case to his father in 1 Samuel 19 verses 4 and 5. Let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, and what he has done has benefited you greatly. He took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistine. The Lord won a great victory for all Israel, and you saw it and were glad. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason? Saul listened. He swore by the Lord that David would not be put to death. Within days, the dark spirit returned, and Saul threw the spear again. David, that night, fled to his own house. Saul sent men to watch the door and kill him in the morning. The escape came through Michal. She let David down through a window, took the household teraphim, a small cult figure of the kind the patriarchal narratives of Genesis associate with Rachel's father Laban, placed it in the bed under a goat's hair quilt, and told the king's men her husband was sick. By the time Saul ordered the bed brought to him so he could kill David in it, David was already in Ramah, 2 hours' walk to the north, with Samuel. There, in the prophetic colony at Naioth, something happened that the Hebrew Bible records with deliberate strangeness. Saul sent 3 groups of messengers to seize David, and each group, on entering the encampment, fell into ecstatic prophesying. Saul came himself. He stripped off his royal robes, prophesied before Samuel, and lay all that day and night exposed before the prophets. The scene ends in 1 Samuel chapter 19 verse 24, with a refrain that echoes an earlier moment in his life. Is Saul also among the prophets? In the first iteration of the saying, years before, the king had been seen as a man newly seized by the Spirit. In the second, he is a man whose spirit has long departed and whom prophecy now overpowers in defeat. David slipped back to Jonathan. The conversation in chapter 20 is the longest sustained dialogue between the two friends the text gives, us. Jonathan refused to believe his father intended murder until David proposed a test, the New Moon Festival, a regular court banquet at which David's seat would be conspicuously empty, would force Saul to declare himself. Jonathan agreed, and the two men devised a system that survives in the text in extraordinary detail. Jonathan would go out into a field on the third day after the festival, accompanied by a boy with a quiver of arrows, and shoot 3 arrows toward a stone marker. If he called to the boy, "The arrows are on this side of you, bring them here," David could come back. If he called, "The arrows are beyond you," David must flee. The festival came. David's place was empty the first day, and Saul thought him ritually unclean. Empty the second, and Saul demanded to know where he was. Jonathan covered for him with a half-truth about a family sacrifice in Bethlehem. Saul's response, in 1 Samuel 20 verses 30 and 31, is the moment the friendship's cost becomes explicit. The king cursed Jonathan in the language of court, called him a son who had shamed his mother, and told him, "As long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Now send and bring him to me, for he must die." Jonathan asked why. Saul threw a spear at his own son. Jonathan rose from the table without finishing the meal. The next morning he went out to the field with the boy. The arrows fell beyond. Jonathan called after the boy in the agreed code, "Isn't the arrow beyond you?" And the boy, hearing only what he was meant to hear, gathered them up and went back to the city. After he had gone, David came out from behind the stone where he had been hiding and bowed to the ground 3 times. The 2 men kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most. Their parting words are preserved in 1 Samuel 20 verse 42. "Go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord is witness between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever.'" David rose and left. Jonathan went back into the city. They would see each other only once more in their lives, years later, in a wood before Jonathan's death on Gilboa. David ran. He had no provisions, no weapon, no plan. The first stop he made, the first sentence in the long story of David as fugitive, was "Shin Shia, ish, and shh," was the priestly settlement at Nob, a small Yahwistic shrine on the ridge between Anathoth and Jerusalem, where the high priest Ahimelech maintained the tent of meeting in the long interregnum between the destruction of Shiloh and the eventual building of the temple. David came alone. He told Ahimelech he was on a secret errand for the king and asked for whatever bread the priest could spare. Ahimelech had only the consecrated showbread, the 12 loaves laid before the Lord and replaced each Sabbath, which by law could be eaten only by priests. He gave them to David anyway, after asking that the men under David's command be ritually clean from women. He also gave him a sword, not just a sword, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod, kept in the sanctuary as a votive trophy since the Valley of Elah. David took it. The narrator notes, with the cold precision the text reserves for moments of impending disaster, in 1 Samuel 21 verse 7, that one of Saul's servants happened to be detained before the Lord that day. His name was Doeg the Edomite, the chief of Saul's shepherds, and he saw everything. David fled south to Gath, of all places, into the city of the man whose head he had carried up the valley a few years earlier. The servants of King Achish recognized him almost at once. To save his life, David, in 1 Samuel 21 verse 13, feigned insanity in their presence. And while he was in their hands, he acted like a madman, making marks on the doors of the gate and letting saliva run down his beard. Achish, disgusted, drove him out. The episode would remain in David's memory long enough that the superscription of the 34th Psalm attributes its composition to that day at Gath, he doubled back into the Judean foothills and took shelter in the cave of Adullam on the western slopes of the wilderness. His brothers and the rest of his father's household came down to join him, fearing Saul's vengeance on Bethlehem itself. And then in 1 Samuel 22 verse 2, all those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. They were the marginal of Iron Age of Judah, men whose social profile is unmistakably that of the Haberu. The Amarna letters of the late Bronze Age complain about disenfranchised stateless populations who fell out of village society and reorganized themselves around a charismatic leader on the desert fringe. By the end of the decade, the 400 would be 600, and they would become the core of David's later royal guard. The retaliation against Nob came when Saul learned what had happened there. Doeg reported the encounter, and Saul ordered the priests killed. The Israelite footmen of Saul's bodyguard refused to lift their swords against priests of the Lord. Doeg did not refuse in 1 Samuel 22 verses 18 and 19. The text records the result with the unornamented specificity the Hebrew Bible reserves for mass killing scenes. That day he killed 85 men who wore the linen ephod. He also put to the sword Nob, the town of the priests with its men and women, its children and infants and its cattle, donkeys and sheep. One son of Ahimelech, Abiathar, escaped and came to David carrying the priestly ephod. From that day David travelled with a priest, and consulting the Lord through the ephod, would shape every move he made. The cat and mouse across the Judean wilderness lasted years. David's men learned the wadis between Ziph, Maon, and the cliffs above the Dead Sea, and twice in those years the chase produced encounters the editors of Samuel would not let the reader miss. The first was at Engedi, on the western shore of the Dead Sea, where the freshwater spring still falls down the cliff between caves used for refuge since the Chalcolithic period. Saul, hunting with 3,000 chosen men, went into one of those caves to relieve himself. David and his men were already inside it, hidden against the rear wall. David crept forward and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Then his conscience struck him. He came out of the cave after Saul, held up the corner, and called across the slope. In 1 Samuel 24 verse 6, he told his men what he had refused to do. "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." Saul, when the words reached him, wept. He acknowledged that David was more righteous than he was. He went home. The second sparing came at the hill of Hachilah, near Ziph. David and his nephew Abishai crept into Saul's camp at night, while the army slept under a deep sleep, the text attributes to the Lord, and stood beside the sleeping king. Abishai whispered the obvious request in 1 Samuel 26 verse 8, "Today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground. With one thrust of the spear I won't strike him twice." David refused. He took only the spear and the water jar from beside Saul's head, retreated to the opposite hill, and called across the valley to Saul's general, mocking him for sleeping while a king lay unguarded. Saul recognized the voice. He blessed David from across the wadi and went home. They would not meet again. Between those two sparings, the strangest interlude in the wilderness years happens. David, demanding tribute from a wealthy sheepherder named Nabal during the spring shearing. The customary moment when local men of property settled accounts with the bands of fighters who had protected their flocks from raids was insulted in front of his men. and rode out intending to kill every male in the household before morning. Nabal's wife Abigail intercepted him on the road, dismounted, fell at his feet, and talked him out of a slaughter that would have stained him for the rest of his life. The narrator preserves David's response in 1 Samuel 25, verses 32 and 33. "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself. With my own hands." Nabal died 10 days later of a stroke. Abigail came to David as his wife. The last phase of the wilderness years was the one the editors of Samuel found most uncomfortable. David, exhausted, crossed back into Philistine territory in the 27th chapter as a vassal of Achish, king of Gath, with his 600 men, his 2 wives, and the families of his soldiers. Achish gave him the frontier settlement of Ziklag in the Negev, a site whose identification has been debated for decades among Tel Serah, Tel Esafi, and the recently excavated Kirbet Arai, where a destruction layer dated to the early 10th century before Christ has reopened the question. From Ziklag, David told Achish he was raiding the southern villages of Judah. In fact, he was raiding Geshurites, Gersites, and Amalekites in the Negev frontier, killing every witness so no report of his real targets could reach Gath. The pretense ended when the Philistine kings mustered for war against Saul at Gilboa. Achish wanted David in the line of battle. The other Philistine lords refused. They did not trust an Israelite mercenary on the day Israel's army would be in front of him. Achish sent David home. He returned to find Ziklag burned to the ground. The Amalekites had raided in their absence and carried off every wife, every child, every possession. David's own men, half mad with grief, talked of stoning him. He turned to the Lord through Abiathar's ephod, asked whether he should pursue, and got the answer that would make him, by the end of that week, both a victorious commander and the first king of Judah. "Pursue them. You will surely overtake them and rescue what was taken." While David and his 600 men were chasing Amalekite raiders south of Ziklag, the Philistine line was forming up far to the north for the war that would end Saul's life. The Philistines had moved their main army from the coastal plain into the Jezreel Valley, the broad, fertile corridor where Israelite chariotry would lose every advantage. They camped at Shunem, on the lower slope of the hill of Moreh. Saul brought the army of Israel up from the south and positioned it on Mount Gilboa, the limestone ridge that closes the valley to the southeast. Between them, in the morning mist of late autumn, somewhere around 1010 before Christ, the political map of Israel was about to be redrawn. Saul went to a medium. The narrator records the visit in 1 Samuel 28 with deliberate strangeness, because Saul himself, earlier in his reign, had banned mediums and necromancers from the land. He went disguised by night with 2 attendants. The medium lived in the village of Endor, on the north side of the same ridge the Philistines were occupying, meaning Saul had to slip through the enemy lines to reach her. The Lord, the text says, had stopped answering him. The Urim and Thummim were silent. The prophets were silent. Dreams were silent. The medium called up Samuel, who had died years earlier, and Samuel's voice came up through the woman with what may be the most terrifying single sentence Saul ever heard. In 1 Samuel 28 verse 19, the dead prophet says, "Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me." Saul collapsed full length on the floor. The medium, the text notes with strange tenderness, fed him bread and a calf before sending him back through the Philistine lines to the Israelite camp. The battle came the next day. The Israelite line broke on the slopes of Gilboa. the Philistines pressed hard against Saul and his sons, and the men closest to him fell first. Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, named in 1 Samuel 31 verse 2, in the order they fell. Saul, wounded by archers, asked his armor-bearer to finish him before the Philistines could capture him alive. The armor-bearer refused. Saul fell on his own sword. The armor-bearer fell on his. The Philistines, the next morning, stripped Saul's body, cut off his head, fastened his corpse and his sons to the wall of Bethshan, and sent the head and armor on a triumph circuit ending in the temple of Dagon. The men of Jabesh Gilead, whose city Saul had once saved at the beginning of his reign, crossed the Jordan by night, took down the bodies from the wall, and buried the bones under a tamarisk tree at home. A messenger ran south to Ziklag. The text in 2 Samuel 1 says, he arrived on the third day after David's return from the Amalekite pursuit, with his clothes torn and dust on his head. He claimed to David, in 2 Samuel 1 verses 9 and 10, to have been present on Gilboa, and said Saul, mortally wounded but still alive, had begged him for the death blow. He delivered Saul's crown and armband as proof. The story conflicts with the account the narrator gave in chapter 31, where Saul dies by his own hand. And most commentators read the messenger as an opportunist hoping for reward. David had him executed for the claim. He then composed the funeral lament that would survive in the same chapter as the Song of the Bow, the most accomplished poem the Hebrew Bible attributes to him. Its refrain is one of the most quoted lines in the whole biblical canon, and it appears for the first of 3 times in 2 Samuel 1 verse 19. Your glory, Israel, lies slain on your heights. How the mighty have fallen! David refused to celebrate the death of the man who had hunted him for 10 years. He moved on Hebron next. Hebron, about 30 kilometers south of Jerusalem, was the natural center of southern Judah, the city of the patriarchs, with an unbroken Iron Age occupation horizon visible in the excavations on Tel Rumeda. Abiathar consulted the Lord through the ephod. The answer was Hebron. David moved his household there with his 2 wives and his 600 men, and the men of Judah came to him and anointed him king over the house of Judah. He was 30 years old. It was the second of the 3 anointings the text records for him. The first, the secret one in Bethlehem. The second, the public one in Hebron over Judah alone. The third, 7 years later, over all Israel. The northern tribes did not come south. Abner, Saul's commanding general, and his cousin had survived Gilboa and crossed the Jordan to Mahanaim, the small fortified site east of the river most often, identified today with the double mound of Tel Ed-Dahab in the lower Jabbok. He took Saul's youngest surviving son, Ishbosheth, and acclaimed him king over the rest of Israel. The civil war began. The first formal scene of it, in 2 Samuel 2, takes place at the Pool of Gibeon, where the spring still rises in a stone-cut shaft. Archaeologists have dated to Iron II, 12 men of Abner's army and 12 of David's general Joab. David's nephew, the most ferocious soldier of his generation, went out for a ritual combat, and each grabbed the other by the head and drove a sword into the other's side, all 24 falling together. The duel that was meant to settle the war turned into a general battle. Abner's army broke. Asahel, Joab's brother, pursued Abner across the plain, refusing to turn aside. And Abner, looking back over his shoulder while running, drove the butt of his spear backward through Asahel's belly. The killing of Asahel made the war personal. Joab would never forget it. The civil war lasted 7 years, with Abner growing stronger in the north and David growing stronger in the south. The decisive break came when Ishbosheth, politically weak and dependent on his general, accused Abner of sleeping with Saul's concubine Rizpah. The accusation, in the political grammar of the ancient Near East, was a charge of attempted usurpation. Taking a former king's concubine was a public claim on succession. Abner exploded. He told Ishbosheth in 2 Samuel 3 verse 9 that he would now transfer the kingdom of Israel to David to establish the throne of David over Israel and Judah from Dan to Beersheba. He sent envoys to Hebron. David accepted on one condition: Michal, his first wife, must be returned to him from the man Saul had given her to. Abner brought her south and began the diplomatic tour of the northern tribes, persuading the elders of Israel to acknowledge David as king. Abner came to Hebron with 20 men to seal the treaty. David received him, hosted a banquet, and let him leave in peace. Joab arrived the next morning, learned what had happened, and was incensed. He sent messengers to call Abner back, met him at the gate, drew him aside as if to speak privately, and stabbed him in the belly. The same wound Abner had once given Asahel, in the same place. The text in 2 Samuel chapter 3 verse 27 notes the symmetry without comment. David, hearing of it, went into public mourning, walked behind the bier himself, refused to eat until the sun set, and composed a brief lament that the text preserves in 2 Samuel 3 verse 33. Should Abner have died as the lawless die? The political effect was as deliberate as the grief was real. The northern tribes saw a king who had not authorized the killing of their last great general. 2 of Ishbosheth's officers finished the work. Rechab and Baanah, mercenary captains from Beeroth in the Benjaminite hills, slipped into Ishbosheth's bedchamber during the heat of the day while the king slept, killed him, cut off his head, and brought it to David at Hebron, expecting reward. They had completely misread the man they were dealing with. David had executed the Amalekite who claimed to have killed Saul. He executed Rechab and Baanah on the same logic. Their hands and feet were cut off and hung beside the pool at Hebron. The head of Ishbosheth was buried in Abner's tomb. With Saul's house finally extinct, the elders of all the tribes of Israel came down to Hebron, struck a covenant with David before the Lord, and anointed him for the 3rd time king over all Israel. He was 37 years old. He would reign 33 more. The first thing David did as king of all Israel was take a city he did not yet own. The capital he had inherited from Saul was Gibeah, the small Benjaminite citadel north of Jerusalem. The capital he had built for himself was Hebron, in the Judean hills to the south. Neither would do for a kingdom that now stretched from Dan to Beersheba. Hebron was too southern, too tribal, too unmistakably Judahite for the northern tribes to accept as the seat of a unified throne. Gibeah belonged to the dead king's clan. Between them, on a long limestone spur falling steeply on 3 sides above the Kidron and Hinnom valleys, sat a small fortified city whose population the conquest narrative in the book of Joshua had explicitly admitted Israel had never taken. It had remained Jebusite for 2 centuries. It had no tribal owner, and in 2 Samuel 5 David moved on it. The Jebusites knew their city was nearly impossible to assault. The narrow ridge of the southeastern hill, sometimes called the City of David in modern archaeological literature, was bounded on 3 sides by sheer cliffs above the deep valleys. The only weak point was the northern saddle, and that was guarded by a small but heavy stone wall. The taunt the defenders shouted from the wall, recorded in 2 Samuel 5 verse 6, has become famous for its arrogance. They told David, "You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off. They were wrong, and the way they were wrong is the most archaeologically interesting sentence in the chapter. In 2 Samuel 5, verse 8, the text says, "On that day David had said, 'Anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies.'" The Hebrew word translated water shaft is tzinah, a term that appears almost nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible since the late 19th century, when Charles Warren first explored the underground water system feeding the Gihon Spring at the foot of the eastern slope. Archaeologists have debated whether the Tzinah refers to the vertical shaft now called Warren's Shaft, the older Middle Bronze Age tunnels uncovered by Reich and Shukron in the 1990s, or some external aqueduct entirely. Whatever it was, a small assault party led by Joab. The text in 1 Chronicles 11 names him explicitly as the man who climbed first and was rewarded with the command of the army. Entered the city through the water system, opened the gates from the inside, and the Jebusite stronghold fell. David moved his court to the city he had taken, and the text begins to call it by a name no other place in the ancient world ever bore: the city of David. He built a fortified residence on the upper terraces of the spur, the area where, in the early 2000s, the archaeologist Eilat Mazar excavated a large stone structure of monumental ashlar masonry sitting directly on top of an older terraced foundation now known as the stepped stone structure. Mazar argued, against considerable scholarly resistance, that the large stone structure dated to the early 10th century before Christ and matched what one would expect of David's palace. The dating remains contested between her camp and Israel Finkelstein's lower chronology, but no excavator on either side denies that something monumental was built on that spur in the early Iron Age, i.e., exactly the moment by any reasonable estimate that David was building his city. The diplomatic recognition came almost immediately. Hiram, king of Tyre, the Phoenician seaport 60 kilometers up the coast, whose name appears in the king lists preserved by the 2nd century historian Menander of Ephesus and quoted by Josephus, fixing Hiram's reign in the early 10th century before Christ, sent David cedar logs from the Lebanon ranges, along with carpenters and stonemasons, to build him a proper palace. Tyrian timber, Phoenician craftsmen, Israelite labor, Jebusite foundations. The palace David lived in for the rest of his life was the architectural signature of a small but real Eastern, Mediterranean polity entering the international system of the early Iron Age. The next move was the move that mattered most: the Ark of the Covenant. The gold-overlaid acacia wood chest that had been the central cult object of Israel since Sinai, captured and returned by the Philistines a generation earlier, and stored since then in the house of Abinadab at Kiriath Jearim, was brought to Jerusalem. The first attempt, recorded in 2 Samuel 6, ended in catastrophe. The ark was loaded onto a new cart, exactly as the Philistines had once carried it. The oxen stumbled near the threshing floor of Nacon. A man named Uzzah, son of Abinadab, reached out to steady the ark and was struck dead on the spot. David, the text says, was angry and he was afraid. He turned aside and left the ark at the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, while he recovered the courage to try again. The second attempt followed the law. The ark was carried on poles by Levites on shoulders, with sacrifices every 6 steps. David himself, wearing a linen ephod, danced before the procession all the way up the slope into the city. The text in 2 Samuel 6 verse 14 says he danced before the Lord with all his might. His wife Michal, watching from a window of the palace, despised him for it, for stripping off the dignity of the king and dancing half naked among the women. When he came home, she met him with the most cutting line the books of Samuel give to any of his wives. In 2 Samuel 6 verse 20 she said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would." But if it met, answered her in the next verse, "I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes." The text adds, with an austerity that closes the marriage, that Michal had no children to the day of her death. The ark was placed in a tent on the upper terrace of the city, near the new palace. Some weeks or months later, the text in 2 Samuel 7 simply says, after the king was settled in his palace and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him. David told the prophet Nathan that he intended to build the ark a permanent house. A cedar palace and a tent were no longer fitting. Nathan, on his own authority, told David to do whatever he had in mind. That night the word of the Lord came to Nathan, reversing the prophet's hasty endorsement and replacing it with the most consequential single oracle in the entire Hebrew Bible. The oracle is what Christian and Jewish tradition would later call the Davidic covenant. The whole of 2 Samuel 7 is its setting, but its central promise sits in verses 12 to 16. "When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." The reversal is exact. David had wanted to build a house for Yahweh. Yahweh promised instead to build a house for David. The Hebrew word for house, bayit, carries both senses at once, a building of stone and a dynasty of blood. And the prophecy turns on the pun. From this moment forward, every theological category the rest of the Hebrew Bible develops about messianic kingship, every prophetic expectation of a future son of David, every Christian claim about Jesus of Nazareth as the Christ, runs back to the words Nathan brought to David that night. David's response, recorded in the rest of the chapter, is one of the longest sustained prayers the Hebrew Bible attributes to him. It ends in 2 Samuel 7 verse 29 with a single petition, "Now be pleased to bless the house of your servant, that it may continue forever in your sight. For you, sovereign Lord, have spoken, and with your blessing the house of your servant will be blessed forever." The political event was a king moving an ark into a tent. The theological event was the founding charter of a dynasty that would outlast every other monarchy of the ancient Near East and reshape the religious imagination of half the world. The covenant in chapter 7 is the theological hinge of David's reign. The next two chapters, chapters 8 and 10 of 2 Samuel, are the political consequence. With Jerusalem secured, the ark installed, and the dynastic promise spoken, David turned outward. The decade that followed produced the largest territorial state any Israelite king would ever rule. Modest by the standards of contemporary Egypt or Assyria, but unprecedented for the Central Highlands, into the political vacuum left by the collapse of the great Late Bronze powers. The Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, the new Kingdom of Egypt. A small Israelite chieftaincy expanded rapidly in the early 10th century before Christ, because there was, for once, no one strong enough to stop it. The first campaign was against the Philistines. The Pentapolis on the coast had assumed, after Saul's death on Gilboa, that Israel was a spent force, and the Philistine kings had attacked David twice in his first year of reign over all the tribes. Both engagements are reported in the closing verses of 2 Samuel 5. The first took place in the valley of Rephaim, just southwest of Jerusalem, where David, having consulted the Lord through the ephod, attacked frontally and broke the Philistine line at a place he renamed Baal-perazim, the master of breakthroughs. The second, weeks later, in the same valley, David won by an oblique flanking maneuver, circling around to the rear of the Philistine line. The text in 2 Samuel 5 verse 24 says, "While he waited to hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees before charging, he pursued the Philistines from Gibeon all the way down the valley to Gezer." The wars summarized in 2 Samuel 8 finished what those battles had started. The text says, David subdued the Philistines and took the city of Metheghamah, almost certainly a reference to Gath itself, which Iron AA archaeology at Tel Es-Safi confirms went into a long demographic decline in the 10th century. The Pentapolis would never threaten Israel as a coordinated military power again. The campaign against Moab was the harshest single act of David's reign. Moab lay across the Jordan, on the high plateau east of the Dead Sea, and David had once trusted Moab enough to leave his parents there for safekeeping during the years he was on the run from Saul. What had broken that relationship by the time of the Empire Wars, the text does not say. Some later Jewish tradition, including the Targum on Ruth, reads a hint into the silence and assumes Moab betrayed his parents. Whatever the cause, in 2 Samuel 8, verse 2, the text describes the punishment. He made them lie down on the ground and measured them off with a length of cord. Every 2 lengths of them were put to death, and the 3rd length was allowed to live. 2/3 of the Moabite military population was executed in the field. The 3rd that lived became Davidic vassals and brought him tribute. The Edomites, on the desert plateau south of the Dead Sea, came next. The decisive engagement was in the Valley of Salt, almost certainly the area south of the Dead Sea where the Idib Wadi al-Mil still cuts through deposits of evaporate salt. And the text in 2 Samuel 8 verse 13 attributes the victory to David himself, while the parallel account in 1 Chronicles 18 credits Abishai, Joab's brother. Joab finished the campaign over a 6-month occupation that, the text in 1 Kings 11 will note years later, killed every adult male in Edom, leaving only women, children, and the boy Prince Hadad, who escaped to Egypt to grow up at Pharaoh's court. Edomite copper, mined at sites like Kirbat en-Nahas in the Wadi Feinan, whose carbon dates have been argued by Thomas Levy to fall squarely within the 10th century before Christ, came into the Israelite tribute system. David garrisoned the country with Israelite troops. The northern campaign was the most ambitious. The Aramean kingdoms of the 10th century before Christ formed a loose patchwork. Aram Damascus to the south, Aram Zobah in the anti-Lebanon range, Bit Rehob beyond it, Hamath further north. The dominant power was Aram Zobah, ruled by Hadadezer son of Rehob. David moved north against him. The text in 2 Samuel 8 says, to restore his control along the Euphrates River. The implied frontier is enormous. The army he met included 1,000 chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers, the kind of force only the larger Aramean confederations could field. David captured the chariot teams and disabled the horses, hamstringing all but 100 of them. Damascus, which sent reinforcements to Hadadezer, fell in turn, and Israelite garrisons were placed inside the city. the bronze taken from the Aramean cities. The text in 1 Chronicles 18 notes would later supply Solomon's bronze sea and pillars in the Jerusalem temple. The Ammonite War was the longest and the strangest. The trigger, the narrator tells in the 10th chapter of 2 Samuel, was diplomatic. The king of Ammon, Nahash, had been an old ally of David's. When Nahash died, David sent envoys to express sympathy to his son Hanun. Hanun's advisors persuaded him the envoys were spies. He had them seized, shaved off half of each man's beard, cut off their robes at the buttocks, and sent them back. The insult was unpardonable. David sent the army across the Jordan, and Joab fought a famous two-front battle near the gates of Rabbah, the Ammonite capital, the modern Ammon, against an Ammonite force in front of him and an Aramean mercenary force behind him. He divided his men, gave Abishai the rear, and broke both forces in a single day. The next year, Hadadezer came south himself with the full Aramean coalition. David crossed the Jordan in person and broke them at Helam, killing 700 charioteers and 40,000 foot. Aram surrendered and made peace. The Ammonites, abandoned by their allies, retreated inside the walls of Rabbah and prepared for siege. Joab took Rabbah's water city the following year. The city's main fortress, on the upper Acropolis, held out longer. He sent word to David in 2 Samuel 12, verse 28, a verse the editors of Samuel hold for the chapter that follows, because they were saving the second half of the Rabbah narrative for the Bathsheba story. To come and take the city himself, lest the city be called by Joab's name. David came, broke the upper city, took the Ammonite king's crown. The text says it weighed a talent of gold, set with precious stones, and put it on his own head. The empire that resulted ran, in summary terms the text uses repeatedly, from Lebo-Hamath in the north, on the border between modern Lebanon and Syria, to the Brook of Egypt in the south, the Wadi el-Arish on the edge of the Sinai. It was a tributary system, not a fully administered province, but it was the largest political structure ever built in the central Levant by an Israelite king. The text in 2 Samuel 8 verse 15 summarizes the result with a single sentence. The rest of the books of Kings will measure every later king. Against, David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. The empire would not survive intact past Solomon's son, but the dynasty would. And in the year Joab took Rabbah, the king who had reigned doing what was just and right was about to do the thing for which the rest of the biblical tradition would never quite forgive him. The chronology of the Bathsheba episode is precise. The 11th chapter of 2 Samuel opens with the line that gives the whole story its political frame. In 2 Samuel 11 verse 1, the text says, "In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem." The detail mattered to the editors of Samuel. Spring was campaigning season. The Ammonite war Joab had begun the previous year was in its final phase. The siege of Rabbah was the climax of the entire imperial decade narrated in chapter 8. And the king, for the first time in his life, was not on the line. The man who had run from Saul through 10 years of caves, who had led 600 from Ziklag, who had broken the Aramean coalition at Helam, was 40-some years old and at home. He walked on the roof of the palace one evening. The text says, "And from that height, the upper terrace of the large stone structure on the eastern slope of the city of David, with its commanding view down into the densely built lower terraces of the city, he could see into the courtyards of the houses below. A woman was bathing. The narrator gives no internal monologue and no dialogue. He gives only a sequence of verbs. David saw, David sent, David asked, the reports come back. Her name is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam. She is the wife of Uriah the Hittite. The mention of Uriah is itself a comment. Uriah is one of the 30, the elite warriors whose names the editors of Samuel preserve in the catalogue of David's mighty men ensue, Samuel 23, a list so old, so historically anchored, that scholars from the early 20th century onward have treated it as one of the most reliable archival sources in the entire books of Samuel. Uriah was, at this exact moment, on the line at Rabbah. His name is also a comment. Uriah, Yahweh is my light, is a Yahwistic name, but his ethnic designation is Hittite, pointing to the population of Anatolian and northern Syrian descent that had spread south through the Levant after the collapse of the Hittite Empire around 1180 before Christ, and that by David's century had assimilated into Israelite religion while retaining the ethnic label. The man whose wife David was about to take was a foreigner who served Israel's God more faithfully than the king he served. Bathsheba conceived. The narrator's report in 2 Samuel 11 verse 5 is 2 words long in the Hebrew, I am pregnant. The political problem was instant. Uriah had been on campaign for months. There was no innocent explanation. David sent for Uriah from the front under cover of an inquiry into the progress of the war, hoping the soldier, given a night at home, would sleep with his wife and so cover the timing of the pregnancy. Uriah refused. He slept at the door of the palace with the king's servants. When David asked him why, Uriah's answer in 2 Samuel 11 verse 11 is the moral center of the chapter. The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my Lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing. The sentence kills him. David tried again the next night, this time getting Uriah drunk. Uriah still slept at the palace door. The king, who could not break the soldier, turned to the only solution left. He wrote a letter to Joab. He sent it back to the front by Uriah's own hand. The letter, in 2 Samuel 11 verse 15, contained 3 sentences. Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest, then withdraw from him, so he will be struck down and die. Joab carried out the order with the trained pragmatism of a general who had done worse for less reason. He sent Uriah to a place near the wall of Rabbah, where Ammonite archers were known to engage from above, withdrew the supporting force at the right moment, and lost a number of other Israelite soldiers in the engagement to disguise the operation. He sent a runner back to Jerusalem with the casualty list. He told the runner, the text says, that if the king grew angry over the unnecessary deaths, the runner was to add at the end, moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead. The phrase did its work. The text in 2 Samuel 11 verse 25 records David's reply, word for word. Don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as another. Press the attack against the city and destroy it. Bathsheba mourned for her husband for the customary days. After the mourning was over, David sent for her, brought her into his house, and she became his wife. She bore him a son. The chapter ends with a single editorial sentence in 2 Samuel 11 verse 27. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. The next chapter opens with a knock on the palace door. Nathan, the same prophet who had brought the dynastic covenant a few years earlier, came to David and told him a story. The story is one of the cleanest pieces of prophetic confrontation literature in the entire Hebrew Bible, and its closest formal parallels lie in the 18th century before Christ Mari, Letters from the Middle, Euphrates, where ecstatic prophets routinely confronted kings on the moral failures of court. Nathan's parable in 2 Samuel 12 verses 1 to 4 describes a rich man who owned many sheep and a poor man who owned only one little ewe lamb, raised in his lap, drinking from his cup, sleeping in his arms like a daughter. A traveler came to the rich man, and rather than slaughter one of his own flock, the rich man took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the meal. David, hearing the story, became furious. In 2 Samuel 12 verses 5 and 6, he swore by the Lord that the rich man deserved to die, and ordered him to pay back the lamb 4 times over. Nathan answered him with the most concentrated single sentence the prophets ever spoke to a king. In 2 Samuel 12 verse 7 he said, "You are the man." The Hebrew is 2 words, Ata Ha'ish. The whole moral architecture of the rest of the chapter rises and falls on those 2 words. The rest of the oracle, in verses 9 to 12, is the judgment. The sword would never depart from David's house. Calamity would rise against him from within his own family. What he had done in secret would be done to his own wives in broad daylight, in front of all Israel. David's response in 2 Samuel 12 verse 13 is also 2 words in the Hebrew, Katati Layu. I have sinned against the Lord. The 51st Psalm, in its superscription, attributes itself to this exact moment. Nathan accepted the confession. The Lord, he said, had taken away the sin, but the child Bathsheba had borne would die. The child fell ill. David fasted, lay on the ground, refused to eat or rise. For the 7 days the boy lingered. The servants were afraid to tell him when the child died. David read it in their faces, washed, ate, and worshipped, and gave them the explanation that has become one of the lines most often quoted from his life in 2 Samuel 12, verse 23. While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. The grief was real. The political damage was permanent. David comforted Bathsheba, the text adds, and went to her again, and she bore another son. They named him Solomon, Shlomo, the peaceful one. The Lord loved him. The prophet Nathan, in 2 Samuel 12 verse 25, came back to the palace and gave the boy a second name from the Lord, Jedidiah, loved by Yahweh. It is the only place in the Hebrew Bible the name appears, and it remains 3,000 years later, the only divinely given throne name attached to any king of Israel. The man who would build the temple was the second child of the marriage that should not have happened. Nathan's prophecy began to unfold inside the palace within a few years. The judgment that the sword would never depart from David's house took the shape of David's own children. The crown prince by birth order was Amnon, son of David's wife Ahinoam. The most beautiful of the daughters was Tamar, full sister of Absalom, son of Maacah, daughter of the king of Geshur in southern Syria. The 13th chapter of 2 Samuel opens with a single sentence the editors of the succession narrative. The long court history Leonhard Rost identified in 1926 as a unified literary source running from 2 Samuel 9 through the 2nd chapter of 1 Kings, placed at the head of everything that follows. In the course of time, Amnon, son of David, fell in love with Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, son of David. What happened next, the text reports in language as restrained, as it is unsparing. Amnon, with the counsel of his cousin Jonadab, feigned illness, asked David to send Tamar to prepare food at his bedside, and assaulted her in his bedchamber. Tamar pleaded with him in 2 Samuel 13 verse 12, "No, my brother, don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing." He overpowered her, and afterward, the text says, he hated her with a hatred greater than the love he had felt before. He sent her away. She tore the ornamented robe she was wearing. The long-sleeved garment the text in verse 18 identifies as the customary dress of unmarried daughters of the king, put ashes on her head, and walked weeping back to her brother Absalom's house. She lived there the rest of her life as a desolate woman. David, when he heard, was furious, but the text in 2 Samuel 13 verse 21 records that he did nothing. Absalom said nothing for 2 years. Then he invited all the king's sons to a sheep-shearing feast at his estate at Baal-Hazor, north of Jerusalem, and ordered his servants, when Amnon was drunk, to kill him. They did. Absalom fled across the Jordan to Geshur, to his maternal grandfather Talmai, and stayed there 3 years. The text in 2 Samuel 13 verse 39 records David's heart in 3 words. He longed to go to Absalom. Joab, reading the king's silence and arranging the politics David was unwilling to handle, sent a wise woman from Tekoa to Jerusalem with a parable that engineered Absalom's recall. Absalom returned. He was forbidden the king's presence for 2 more years before David finally kissed him. Absalom used the next 4 years to build a base. He rose early, the text in 2 Samuel 15 says, and stood at the city gate where every Israelite coming to the king for justice passed him first. He would tell each one his case was good and right, then add that there was no one appointed by the king to hear it. He kissed the men who tried to bow to him. He lived ostentatiously with a chariot, 50 runners, and the most beautiful hair in Israel. Slowly, the narrator says, he stole the hearts of the people of Israel. When the moment came, he asked David's permission to go to Hebron to fulfill a vow. The choice of Hebron was deliberate. It was the city where David had first been anointed, the original capital, the seat of southern legitimacy. From Hebron, Absalom proclaimed himself king. The conspiracy was wider than David had realized. Ahithophel the Gilonite, his most trusted counselor, and the genealogies suggest Bathsheba's grandfather joined Absalom. So did much of the militia of Judah. David, hearing in Jerusalem that the hearts of the men of Israel had turned, did the thing no one expected. He abandoned the city. In 2 Samuel 15 verse 14, he told his officials, "Come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin on us and put the city to the sword." He left 10 concubines to look after the palace, walked barefoot up the Mount of Olives weeping, and crossed the Kidron with his household, his bodyguard of Cherethites and Pelethites, and 600 men from Gath under Ittai the Gittite. The Levites brought the ark out of the city to follow him. David sent it back. In 2 Samuel 15 verse 25, he told Zadok the priest, "If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it and his dwelling place again. But if he says, 'I am not pleased with you,' then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him." 2 strategic moves saved him. The first was Hushai the Archite, an old friend whom David sent back into Jerusalem to feign loyalty to Absalom and undermine Ahithophel's counsel from the inside. The second was the network of priests and servants who would carry intelligence out of the city to David across the Jordan. By the time Absalom entered Jerusalem, Hushai was already in place at his court. Absalom, in a public act calculated to consummate his usurpation, took the 10 concubines David had left and slept with them in a tent pitched on the roof of the palace, exactly fulfilling the prophecy Nathan had given a decade earlier. Ahithophel counseled an immediate strike with 12,000 chosen men before David could organize across the Jordan. The counsel was sound. It would have ended the rebellion that night. Hushai countered it in 2 Samuel 17 with a longer plan that flattered Absalom's ego and bought David the most valuable thing on earth in that moment, which was time. Absalom accepted Hushai's plan. Ahithophel saw that the rebellion was lost, rode home to Gilo, set his house in order, and hanged himself. One of the very few suicides the Hebrew Bible records. David crossed the Jordan to Mahanaim, the eastern tribes, the very Gileadites Saul had once saved at Jabesh Gilead, fed him, equipped him, and gave him the ground to assemble a counterforce. Joab took command of the army. The decisive battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim, a wooded ridge on the eastern side of the Jordan, whose oaks and broken terrain swallowed the larger Israelite force Absalom had assembled in the open plain. The text in 2 Samuel 18 verse 8 says that on that day the forest claimed more lives than the sword did. Absalom himself, riding under the low branches of a great oak, caught his head in the boughs and was left hanging from the tree as his mule walked out from under him. A soldier found him and reported it to Joab. David's command to all 3 of his generals before the battle had been explicit: "Be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake." Joab took 3 javelins and drove them through Absalom's heart, while the boy was still alive in the tree. 10 of his armor-bearers finished him. The runner who brought the news to David at the gate of Mahanaim was the priest's son Ahimaaz, who arrived first but could not bring himself to tell the king his son was dead. A Cushite messenger arriving moments later did. David's reaction, recorded in 2 Samuel 18 verse 33, is one of the most quoted laments in the Hebrew Bible. "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. O Absalom, my son, my son." Joab came into the king's chamber and rebuked him, told him that if he did not stop weeping for the son who had hunted him, and start thanking the soldiers who had saved his life, he would lose every man in his army by morning. David rose. He went to the gate. He received the troops as they returned. The kingdom did not snap back into place at once. As David crossed the Jordan to return to Jerusalem, a Benjaminite named Sheba, son of Bichri, sounded a horn and called the northern tribes away. In 2 Samuel 20, verse 1, he said, "We have no share in David, no part in Jesse's son. Every man to his tent. Israel!" David sent Joab north after Sheba. Joab pursued him to the walled city of Abel-Beth-Maachah in the upper Jordan Valley and besieged it. A wise woman of the city negotiated with Joab from the wall. The men of the city threw Sheba's head down to him over the parapet, and the rebellion ended. The king came home. The throne was, for the moment, his again, but the cost had been counted. The sword had not departed from his house, and would not depart from it again. The census came late in his reign. The text in 2 Samuel 24 says, David ordered Joab to count the fighting men of Israel and Judah. And Joab, normally the most willing instrument of the king's worst impulses, this time refused. He warned David in 2 Samuel 24 verse 3, "May the Lord your God multiply the troops 100 times over, and may the eyes of my lord the king see it. But why does my lord the king want to do such a thing?" David overruled him. Joab and the army commanders covered the country in 9 months and 20 days, working the tribes from the southern desert to Dan and back through Tyre and Sidon, and reported the count: 800,000 sword-bearing men in Israel, 500,000 in Judah. The narrator does not say directly why the census was a sin. Most commentators, from the rabbinic tradition through John Calvin to P. Kyle MacArthur, read the offence as an act of royal pride that imagined the king's strength to lie in his soldiery rather than in the Lord. David's heart struck him. The prophet Gad came to him with 3 options: 3 years of famine, 3 months of military defeat, or 3 days of plague. David chose the plague. 70,000 died across the country. The angel of the Lord, the text says, was about to extend his hand against Jerusalem itself when the Lord called him back at the threshing floor of a Jebusite landowner named Araunah on the upper hill north of the city of David. David bought the threshing floor. He insisted in 2 Samuel 24 verse 24 on paying full price even when Araunah offered to give it freely. "I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing." He paid 50 shekels of silver for the floor and the oxen, raised an altar, and the plague stopped. The location of that altar would become the most contested square of land in human history. The chronicler, in 1 Chronicles 22, identifies it explicitly as the site of the future temple Solomon would build. The rocky outcrop now under the Dome of the Rock at the center of the Temple Mount, an ancient threshing floor on a ridge of bedrock that from the Bronze Age onward had likely served as a Jebusite cult site. David's purchase of it, in the editorial logic of the chronicler, is the bridge between Jerusalem, the political capital, and Jerusalem, the cultic center. David grew old and could not keep warm. The first chapter of 1 Kings opens with his servants searching the country for a young woman to lie beside him at night for warmth. They found Abishag the Shunammite, who served him as nurse though. The text in 1 Kings 1 verse 4 is careful to note the king had no relations with her. The detail tells the reader the king's strength was visibly gone. His 4th son, Adonijah, Absalom's full brother by Haggith, the eldest surviving prince after the deaths of Amnon and Absalom, read the political weather and moved. He gathered chariots and runners just as Absalom once had, secured the support of Joab and Abiathar the priest, and held a coronation feast at the spring of Enrogel south of the city, where he had himself acclaimed king while David still lived in his palace half a kilometer to the north. Bathsheba and Nathan moved to counter him. Nathan came to Bathsheba and reminded her of David's old promise that Solomon would succeed him. She went into the king's bedchamber, bowed and reported what was happening at Enrogel. Nathan came in moments later with the choreography of a man who knew his timing and confirmed the report. David, the text says, rallied the way he had rallied at every earlier crisis of his career. He swore by the Lord in 1 Kings 23, 1 verse 30, "As I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne in my place." He summoned Zadok the priest, the prophet Nathan, and Benaiah, commander of the bodyguard, and ordered Solomon set on the king's own mule, taken down to the spring of Gihon, the natural spring at the foot of the eastern slope of the city of David, where Hezekiah's later tunnel still channels water into the pool of Siloam. and anointed there before all the people. The shofar was blown. The crowd shouted, "Long live King Solomon!" The noise reached Adonijah's banquet at Enrogel, and the guests scattered. Adonijah ran for sanctuary at the horns of the altar. Solomon let him live, on the condition that he show himself a worthy man. The last formal scene of David's life is the charge to Solomon. The aged king summoned his son and gave him the political testament that Christian and Jewish readers have long understood as the bookend to the Davidic covenant. In 1 Kings 2 verses 2 and 3, David said, "I am about to go the way of all the earth. So be strong, act like a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him, and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations, as written in the law of Moses." He told him to remember the loyalty of Barzillai, the Gileadite who had fed the army at Mahanaim. He told him to deal carefully with Joab and with Shimei the Benjaminite, who had cursed him during the flight from Absalom. The political house was being put in order with the same precision that had characterized the king's better years. The chronicler's parallel adds a second farewell, addressed not to Solomon alone, but to the whole assembly of the leaders of Israel. David showed them the plans he had drawn for the temple Solomon would build, the materials he had stockpiled, the courses of priests and Levites he had organized. He led the assembly in a final prayer. In 1 Chronicles 29 verse 11 he said, "Yours, Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the majesty and the splendor, for everything in heaven and earth is yours." It is the prayer the King James translators, 2.5 millennia later, would render in the cadences that eventually entered Christian liturgy as the doxology of the Lord's Prayer. David died after reigning 40 years, 7.5 in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. The text in 1 Kings 2 verse 10 gives the burial in a single sentence. Then David rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. The tomb itself was somewhere on Chew and Fiuf, the southeastern slope of the spur, the upper end of the early Iron Age city. 500 years later, the prophet Nehemiah would mention the tombs of the kings of David's house as still visible on that slope. The dynasty he founded ran longer than any other monarchy in the ancient Near East. 21 kings of his line sat on the throne in Jerusalem after him, in unbroken succession from Solomon to Zedekiah, until the Babylonian armies of Nebuchadnezzar broke the city in 586 before Christ. 424 years. The Teldan Stele, written in Aramaic about 150 years after his death, calls the line by his name, the Baiti Dabrigut, the House of David. The Mesha Stele in Moab, in roughly the same period, almost certainly does the same. By the prophets of the exile and the return, his name had become shorthand for the future hope of Israel. By the Gospels, 1,000 years after his death, the genealogies of Matthew and Luke would still trace the line of a carpenter in Galilee back to a shepherd, boy in Bethlehem. The horn of oil that Samuel had emptied on a teenager in his father's pasture was, by any reasonable measure of historical influence, the most consequential anointing ever performed by any prophet of any religion in the world. He died around the year 970 before Christ. He has not stopped mattering since.